She brought her find to the hospital to help her husband, but instead of help, she got lies. The doctor hid the stone, confident that she would keep quiet. He didn't know who he was dealing with, or how far she was willing to go. See how one woman forced the system to speak up. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The sun had not yet broken through the overcast sky when Ella tightened the straps of her worn leather boots and stepped outside into the chilled breath of morning. The old mining town, if it could still be called a town, stirred with reluctant, life-flickering porch lights, the distant hum of a solitary pickup truck, and the sharp scent of coal dust already lingering in the air like an old habit no one could shake. Her house stood at the end of a narrow dirt road, its paint chipped, its roof sagging just enough to make it look as tired as she felt most days. The porch creaked under her weight, and for a second she paused, glancing back toward the single-lit window in the bedroom. Henry would still be asleep, or pretending to be. She touched the side of the doorframe with her fingertips, more ritual than necessity, and started the long walk toward the bus that would take her to the mine. Inside the rickety vehicle, young men slouched in their seats, laughing too loud at jokes that didn't warrant laughter. They barely acknowledged her, some not at all. One or two nodded with vague respect, the kind reserved for someone they couldn't quite mock openly. Ella, small but sturdy, adjusted her heavy coat and lowered herself onto a seat by the window. Her hands, thick with calluses and dust-stained creases, gripped the canvas lunch bag in her lap. On its side was stitched a faded patch. Henry Ella, 1979. She'd never replaced it. As the bus rumbled past dying stores and boarded-up homes, Ella closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't sleep, not exactly. She just drifted a habit she'd learned years ago when her body had more aches than answers. When the brakes squealed and the air brakes hissed at the entrance to the site, she opened her eyes again. This was what she did. This was what remained. The mine loomed ahead, a dark maw cut into the earth, surrounded by steel towers and cracked pavement. The foreman, a man young enough to be her grandson, barely glanced up from his clipboard as she approached. She signed her name, nodding at the other workers filing in. The younger ones still snickered sometimes, calling her Granny Cole, or worse, but not to her face. Ella had outlasted most of their fathers. Inside, the earth was cold and breathing. Every tunnel exhaled dampness, and the walls sweated beneath weak yellow bulbs, strung like veins along the passage. She moved with practiced steps, shovel in hand, her helmet light cutting through the dim. The routine dulled pain. It dulled everything. That's why she did it. But her thoughts were never far from Henry. Back home, he lay in the same bed he had occupied for 2 decades. His legs curled under wool blankets he could no longer feel, his face framed by the plastic of a breathing mask and the creased lines of weariness. Ella thought of him every time her pick hit stone, every time her breath grew short, every time the silence of the mine deepened. She wasn't working for the money, it was never enough, but for the rhythm. The rhythm kept her from unraveling. The day passed slowly. A chain snapped on one of the cart lifts, sending everyone scattering for cover, but no one was hurt. The supervisor cursed and reassigned workers across sections. Ella ended up with 2 others on a deep-end shaft that hadn't been cleared in months, maybe years. It was an old tunnel, one she didn't recognize. That in itself was odd. She'd worked every inch of the mine, but she didn't argue. She simply followed orders. The shaft sloped downward more steeply than most, and the walls here were rougher, untouched by newer reinforcements. She moved slowly, prodding ahead with the butt of her shovel, testing the ground for weakness. Her companions, young, inexperienced, loud joked behind her, their voices bouncing off the rock like echoes of arrogance. She ignored them. Then something changed. As she swung her pick against a seam of brittle rock, she saw it. A faint shimmer, barely a glimmer hidden beneath layers of soot and stone. At first she thought it was mica or quartz, common enough. But the color wasn't right. It wasn't dull or pale. It glowed, a subtle bluish hue pulsing from within, as if the rock held breath. She paused, narrowed her eyes. Carefully she chipped around it, not directly at it, easing away the debris until the shape of it revealed itself. No bigger than a plum, the stone sat embedded in the rock like a secret. It was smooth, warm to the touch, and impossibly light. When she held it in her palm, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a quiet spark of awe. Quickly, instinctively, she wrapped it in her old handkerchief and slipped it into her coat. She didn't tell the others. She didn't know why. When the shift ended, she changed out of her gear in silence. The men were still joking, tossing helmets, wiping sweat from their faces. She said nothing, just walked to the bus, sat in her usual seat, and pressed the hand that held her coat closer to her chest. At home, the light in the bedroom window flickered dimly. She found Henry sleeping, or pretending again. She kissed his forehead, warmed his soup, helped him eat. His hand trembled as he held the spoon. His eyes met hers, clouded, tired, but still watching her with the same fierce love he had carried all their years. She didn't tell him about the stone. Later, after he drifted into a medicated sleep, she pulled the handkerchief from her coat and laid it on the table. Under the kitchen lamp, the stone shimmered again, softer now, not glowing, but undeniably alive in a way no ordinary rock could be. She stared at it, heart thudding gently in her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she wondered what it might mean to hope. She didn't sleep that night. Not really. She sat near the window with the stone in her lap, the stars hidden behind clouds, the earth quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the occasional sigh from Henry's room. When morning came, she wrapped the stone again and placed it carefully into her bag. She wasn't sure what she would do yet. She only knew it mattered, and that whatever it was, it would begin today. The morning arrived not with promise, but with dread. Ella had drifted in and out of shallow sleep, her head nodding forward in the creaking chair by the window, her hands still curled loosely in her lap, where the stone had rested most of the night. Her back ached, her eyes stung, and her mind was crowded with half-formed thoughts that made no sense in the light. The stone lay once again wrapped in the handkerchief, tucked carefully into the inside pocket of her bag, the same place she kept Henry's prescription list and the last good photograph they had taken together, decades ago. She stirred a pot of oatmeal that morning with a heaviness she could not name. In the bedroom, Henry moaned softly. The sound was different, less discomfort, and more distress. She went to him quickly, her spoon clattering into the sink. He was curled tighter than usual, his face pale and wet with sweat, his eyes darting behind his lids as if chased through sleep. She touched his shoulder and he flinched. When he opened his eyes, they were wild with pain. The ambulance came slower than she would have liked, but she didn't complain. The two medics, one an older woman with indifferent eyes, the other a young man with headphones hanging around his neck, moved with mechanical precision. They didn't speak much to her. Their focus was on Henry, whose breaths came in shallow, rattling gasps. Ella answered questions quickly, efficiently. No new medications. Yes, he'd eaten. No fever before this morning. She clutched her bag tightly as they lifted him onto the stretcher. The ride to the hospital was bumpy, each turn jostling the contents of the bag at her feet. The stone shifted against the side of her thermos. She couldn't stop thinking about it. Not even now. They admitted Henry without ceremony, wheeling him into a curtained room. Ella was told to wait outside in the corridor. She sat down on the cracked plastic chair nearest the wall, her bag held close against her side. Around her, the hallway buzzed with the quiet chaos of hospital life nurses moving briskly, monitors beeping faintly behind doors, a child crying somewhere far off. She watched each person pass with tired eyes, her mind circling between fear for Henry and the strange, persistent awareness of what lay hidden in her bag. She barely noticed the man approach until he was standing directly in front of her. His presence cut through the hallway like a sharp wind. He was tall, well-groomed, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and eyes the color of old steel. His white coat was spotless. He didn't smile, but there was a certain warmth in his voice that felt studied. "Mrs. Merriweather?" he asked, glancing at the chart in his hand. She nodded slowly. "I'm Dr. Milton. I'm overseeing your husband's care today. I'd like to speak with you for a moment, if that's all right." She stood, stiff and cautious, and followed him down the corridor to a small, tidy consultation room. Inside there was only a table, 2 chairs, and a shelf with unread brochures. Dr. Milton gestured for her to sit. "Your husband's condition is stable for now," he said smoothly, placing the chart on the table. "But we're concerned about an episode of acute cardiac stress. Has he experienced anything like this before?" "Not like this," she answered softly. "He has episodes. But this was worse." He nodded. "We'll be running some tests to see what we can find. In the meantime, there's another matter I wanted to bring up." He leaned slightly forward. "One of the nurses reported that your personal items were left briefly unattended in your husband's room when he was brought in. In reviewing the area for safety, we discovered something unusual." Ella's stomach tightened. The doctor reached beneath the table and set down a small tray. On it, resting atop the familiar cloth she had wrapped it in, was the stone. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked from the stone to Dr. Milton's expression, mild, professional, unreadable. "I assume this belonged to you?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I found it," she said. Her voice was rougher now, wary. "In the mine. Yesterday." Dr. Milton nodded slowly. He picked up the stone, holding it gently between thumb and forefinger. Under the fluorescent lights, it looked less remarkable. No glow, no shimmer. Just a smooth, pale blue stone. But she could tell by the way he handled it that he knew it was something else. "I've seen samples like this before," he said casually, as if remarking on the weather. "They're usually just bits of colored quartz or feldspar. Nothing valuable. But in hospitals, we have strict protocols regarding unidentified mineral specimens, especially those found in industrial areas. Some can be hazardous." Ella's eyes narrowed. "It's not hazardous. Perhaps not, but it would need to be tested. You understand, I'm sure." He wrapped it again and placed it back on the tray. "We'll hold it temporarily just to ensure it poses no danger to patients or staff. After that, if it's deemed harmless, we'll return it or dispose of it, depending on its nature." "No," she said quickly. "It's mine." His smile was thin and dry. "With respect, Mrs. Merriweather, it was found on company property. Technically, any materials recovered from that site are the legal possession of—" "I didn't take it from them," she interrupted, her voice rising. "They threw that shaft away, left it to rot. I was sent there by mistake." Dr. Milton leaned back. His eyes never left hers. "We're not accusing you of wrongdoing," he said. "We simply need to follow protocol." Ella stood slowly. "I want it back." "We'll be in touch," he said with finality, rising as well. "In the meantime, your husband's results should be ready within a few hours. The nurse will find you if anything changes." He opened the door. She stared at him for another long moment before walking out without a word. Back in the hallway, the air felt colder. She returned to her chair and sat, her body tight with anger and confusion. The tray with the stone had not followed her. She wanted to march back in and demand it, but she didn't know the rules here. She didn't know if she had any power at all. The next few hours passed in haze. She was allowed back into Henry's room briefly. He was sleeping, his face drawn, the machines around him blinking and humming like small, indifferent gods. She sat beside him, took his hand, and said nothing. What could she say? That a stranger had stolen something she barely understood? That a stone, perhaps worthless, perhaps priceless, had become the only leverage she had in a world built to ignore her? When the nurse came to check his vitals, Ella asked her about the stone. The woman shrugged, said she didn't know anything about it, and left without further comment. Ella walked home that evening in a daze. The bus had stopped running by the time they released her, and she hadn't the energy to argue for a ride. The stone's absence weighed on her more than she thought possible. Not because of greed, she didn't dream of riches, but because, for the first time in years, she had held something in her hand that might have made a difference. Something that might have pulled Henry out of that bed, out of that room. Something more than pills and hope. And now it was gone. At home, the house felt hollower than before. She fed the cat that wandered by sometimes, changed Henry's linens, and then sat again at the kitchen table, staring at the empty spot where she had once laid the stone. She stayed there for hours until the cold crept in under the door and the light from the single bulb overhead began to flicker. By midnight, she made her decision. She would not go quietly. The next morning broke with an emptiness Ella hadn't felt in years. Henry was still in the hospital, In the house, though, always quiet felt now like it had lost its breath entirely. The walls creaked with age. The floors complained beneath her feet. But the sounds no longer comforted her. They only reminded her of how little remained. She sipped weak coffee at the kitchen table, the steam barely rising, her hands wrapped around the mug more for warmth than taste. Her eyes drifted to the corner where she'd sat just nights ago, the glowing stone nestled in her palm, pulsing like a promise. Now there was nothing but dust and shadows. Her anger sat just beneath her skin, quiet but alive. The doctor's voice still echoed in her ears, clinical, condescending, practiced. She hadn't slept. Not really. She had lain awake imagining the white-coated man examining the stone under his desk lamp, plotting how to keep it, how to explain it away if anyone asked. He hadn't needed to be forceful. He had simply taken advantage of her uncertainty. And the worst part was that he probably expected her to forget it, to let it go, as if she wouldn't notice, as if women like her never pushed back. But she would not forget, and she would not be dismissed. By mid-morning, Ella pulled on her heavy coat, slipped Henry's photo and list of medications into her bag, and walked toward the town's small public library. The streets were cold and empty, the kind of winter air that stung the face and settled into the joints. Her knees ached with each step, but her stride never slowed. She hadn't been to the library in years, not since Henry's accident, but she remembered it well. A red brick building with ivy crawling up one wall and faded posters in the windows announcing events no one attended. Inside, the warmth was a welcome surprise. The scent of books, old carpet, and heating vents greeted her like an old friend. She stepped toward the front desk, where a young woman with a kind, intelligent face looked up from a stack of returned paperbacks. Her name tag read Chloe. Ella cleared her throat. "Do you have internet access here?" Chloe smiled. "We do. Public terminals are just over there." She paused, noticing the woman's age, her clothes dusted with coal. "Can I help you find something?" Ella hesitated, then nodded. "I need to talk to someone who knows about stones, minerals, rocks that glow." Chloe blinked, her curiosity instantly piqued. "Are you a collector?" "I found something," Ella said. "Or I did. It's gone now. But I remember what it looked like. I need someone who can tell me what it was." Chloe nodded thoughtfully, setting her stack aside. "I know someone at the university. He's a geologist, works with rare earth materials. I helped him with a project once. I can try to reach him if you like." Ella let out a slow breath, a mix of relief and anxiety. "Please." They sat together at one of the computer desks. Chloe pulled up her email and typed quickly. Within minutes, she had a video call scheduled. Ella waited, fidgeting slightly, brushing her fingers over the frayed strap of her bag. Then the screen came to life, and a man with glasses and a beard appeared, seated in a cluttered office surrounded by stone samples and open textbooks. "Dr. Martin," Chloe said, "this is Ella Merriweather. She has a question for you about a mineral she found." Ella leaned forward. "I found a stone," she said plainly. "Blue, round, small. It glowed in the dark. It wasn't like anything I'd seen before." Martin nodded slowly. "Glowed, you say? Not reflective? Not catching the light, but actually emitted light?" "Yes," Ella said. "It wasn't bright, just breathing, like something inside it moved." Chloe leaned in. "She found it while working in a mine." Martin raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. Was it warm to the touch?" "Yes." "Lightweight?" Ella nodded. He scratched his beard. "There's a mineral luminite, extremely rare. Typically forms under specific pressure conditions in underground volcanic pockets. It emits a soft blue phosphorescence when undisturbed, and under the right circumstances, it maintains thermal consistency even outside the source environment. It's incredibly valuable, both financially and scientifically. Used in optical tech and precision tools, could be worth a fortune, depending on purity and origin." Ella's heart pounded. "It's gone," she said. "A doctor took it, said it might be dangerous, that it had to be disposed of." The man on the screen frowned. "If it's what I think it is, that would be theft. Pure and simple. You say you recovered it yourself?" "Yes, in the mine. An old shaft they don't use anymore. Chloe glanced at Ella, then back at the professor. Can she do anything? If it was taken without her permission, and she has any record of having found it, she has a claim, especially if it was from a shaft no longer in active use. But she'll need proof and witnesses. Ella's lips pressed into a line. She didn't have paperwork, but she had memory, and maybe someone who would believe her. Chloe printed the email transcript and Martin's follow-up notes. She also helped Ella write a brief affidavit of what happened. Ella took the papers and tucked them into her bag beside Henry's photo. It was a beginning. The next morning, Ella returned to the hospital. Henry was sitting up, though weak, and smiled faintly when she entered. She kissed his forehead, told him she would explain later, and asked him to be strong just a little longer. Then she walked to the administration desk and requested to speak with Dr. Milton. The receptionist's eyes narrowed slightly, but she made the call. After a short wait, Ella was ushered into a different office, this one colder, less inviting. Dr. Milton stood behind a desk, arms folded. "I'd like my stone returned," Ella said. He did not blink. "Mrs. Merriweather, I explained yesterday." "It's called luminite," she interrupted. "I spoke to a geologist. He says it's rare, valuable, and has industrial uses. You knew what it was when you saw it. That's why you took it." The doctor's lips tightened. "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth," she said calmly. "I want it back, or I go to the police and the press." Milton's gaze sharpened, the friendliness from before replaced with calculation. "Even if such a stone existed, and I am not admitting that its legal ownership would likely default to the mining company." "I already checked," Ella lied. "The shaft's abandoned. No current claim. And I have documentation. Witnesses." For a moment, the silence was louder than any alarm. Then Milton's smile returned, thinner, colder. "Mrs. Merriweather, I urge you to reconsider this path. It won't end the way you think it will. You're not young. You don't have the resources to fight this. And dragging your name through the news won't do your husband any favors." Ella stared at him. "You're not the first man to underestimate me," she said. "You won't be the last." She left without waiting for permission. That evening, she went to the mine. She found the younger workers in the break room, men who had mocked her once, now quieter in her presence. She told them the story, not with drama, but with conviction. She spoke of the shaft, the stone, the theft, and the silence that followed. One of the younger men, Jared, recorded her on his phone. She didn't object. By the next day, the video was online. It spread faster than she imagined. Comments poured in. Other workers began sharing their own stories. Items found and quietly taken. Warnings given. Voices silenced. The mine's name trended on social media. Reporters called. Someone posted a satellite photo of the shaft she mentioned, marked inactive since 1994. Local news stations showed up with cameras. Ella stood at the entrance to the mine with Chloe beside her. She spoke clearly and simply, her voice firm. "I worked this ground for 40 years. I know every tunnel, every beam. That stone wasn't just a rock. It was a lifeline. And someone tried to take it from me." Dr. Milton's office went dark the next day. Rumors swirled. Then came confirmation. An internal investigation had been launched. Police found the stone locked in his private drawer. He was suspended pending legal action. Ella was called in to identify the stone. She held it again under the cold lights of an evidence room. It still shimmered, still pulsed softly, as if remembering her hand. She signed the statement with a steady hand. By the time she returned home, the world had shifted slightly on its axis. The old house still sagged. The wind still bit. But inside, something had changed. Not the stone. Her. The courtroom was quiet except for the soft shuffling of papers and the occasional creak of chairs as people shifted in their seats. Ella sat near the front, her back straight despite the weight of the moment, her fingers clasped loosely in her lap. Henry was not with her, still recovering in the clinic, but she had brought his photograph and tucked it into her coat like armor. The judge, a pale man with wire-frame glasses and a perpetually furrowed brow, peered over the bench at the modest crowd. To the right, Dr. Milton sat beside his attorney, lips tight and eyes fixed on the table before him. Ella's heart pounded with quiet insistence, but her face betrayed none of it. She had testified earlier that morning, her voice steady as she described the events in detail. The shift at the mine, the unexpected shaft, the blue glow of the stone, the moment she held it in her hands and knew, without knowing why, that it was different. She spoke of Henry, of the hospital, of the quiet theft and the even quieter defiance that followed. She did not embellish. She didn't need to. Now she listened as others gave their accounts. Chloe described the library meeting, the call to the university geologist, the swift response from the scientific community once the video spread online. Jared, the young miner, spoke of Ella's reputation at the mine, of her decades of work, her tenacity, and the fear that gripped many of the workers whenever something unusual was discovered underground. A quiet pattern, never written, but enforced all the same. If you found something that sparkled, you handed it off, or risked losing your job. Then came the evidence. The stone itself was presented in a glass case, its soft blue glow now familiar, its presence a kind of quiet witness. The university's valuation was read aloud. Not only rare, but nearly pure, with applications in optics, advanced tools, and materials research. Estimated market value, $286,000. The room murmured, then fell silent again. When the final arguments concluded, the judge requested a recess. Ella stepped outside the courtroom into the cold corridor, where the light from the high windows filtered in like faint promises. Chloe joined her, handing her a paper cup of water. "You did it," she said simply. Ella shook her head. "Not yet." The verdict came before noon. The judge ruled that the shaft from which the stone had been recovered was inactive and unclaimed by the mining company for over 20 years. No documentation existed to prove corporate ownership of incidental discoveries. The court recognized that Ella had recovered the stone by her own labor during a legally undefined reassignment and had carried it with the intent of evaluating it for personal use. The attempted concealment by Dr. Milton constituted an act of unlawful appropriation. The court awarded Ella full ownership of the stone, but it was what she did next that surprised everyone. That afternoon, seated at a long table in a university boardroom with a cluster of lawyers, scientists, and administrative staff, Ella declined the full cash payout for the mineral. Instead, she proposed something else. She would permit the university to retain the stone for research, under the condition that 50% of any proceeds derived from applications, patents, or commercial use be redirected into a public medical fund for retired miners and their families. She also requested that a portion be used to establish a scholarship fund for children of miners to pursue higher education. "And the rest?" one of the lawyers asked. She smiled faintly. "Just enough for my husband's care, and a quiet place for us to live out what's left." The university agreed. News spread quickly. Headlines spoke of the miner's stone, the woman who shook the system, and one spark in the dark. Talk shows debated her decision. Some called it saintly, others foolish, but most simply saw her as something rare, a figure of truth in a world that had learned to live without it. Ella did not return to the mine. Henry was moved into a private clinic with better care, a clean room, and a garden courtyard. His condition improved steadily, his breath less labored, his eyes brighter with each passing day. She spent most afternoons at his side, knitting scarves she rarely finished, reading old books aloud, or simply watching the wind move through the trees outside the window. Sometimes, when he was asleep, she walked the grounds. Other times, she sat near the small pond in the back and watched the reflections change with the light. The stone no longer belonged to her physically, but its presence remained in her life, in the warmth of the bed they gave Henry, in the hands of doctors who actually listened, in the letters she received from strangers thanking her for what she had done. She never claimed to be a hero. When reporters came, she told them the same thing every time. "I'm just a miner," she said, "and a wife, that's all." At the mine, a new plaque was mounted near the entrance. It bore her name and the date of her final shift. Below it, a quote was engraved from one of her early interviews. "We spend our lives digging for value in the dark. Sometimes we bring it up with us." Younger workers began leaving small stones at the base of the plaque, tokens of respect, each a quiet promise that they wouldn't forget. The tradition grew until the base of the wall shimmered with tiny gifts from the earth. Ella's home never changed much. She didn't move to the city or build anything grand. She kept the same battered chair by the window, the same creaking floor, the same worn kitchen table. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was peaceful. One evening, she sat by Henry's side in the garden. The sun was setting, casting long golden rays through the tall trees, lighting the edges of his face like a photograph slowly developing. He looked at her, the corners of his mouth curled upward. "You still wear that coat," he whispered. "It still fits," she replied, squeezing his hand. In the distance, someone played a harmonica. Birds stirred in the trees. The world, once so cold and indifferent, seemed suddenly full of quiet song. Inside the university's geology wing, the stone rested in a climate-controlled case. Visitors came to see it, scientists, students, even schoolchildren. A placard beneath the display read, "Luminite, donated by Ella Merriweather, discovered in inactive shaft E12, recovered through personal courage and public witness, a symbol of dignity, perseverance, and truth." There was a second line, smaller and less formal, carved into the wood beneath the plaque. The light wasn't in the stone, it was in the woman who carried it. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our next videos and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.